Kim Magnay. I work with Up to Us Land Care Alliance, for those of you who don't know me. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet on today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. So this evening we're speaking, or we're wining and dining with Karen Retra. Now, Karen wears many hats, but the most relevant one to this evening probably is that she's the co-founder and the co-coordinator of the Wild Pollinator Count. I just ask, so Karen will be, tonight we just thought Karen will be speaking for 45 minutes or so, half an hour, 45 minutes this evening. It would be great if everyone could keep their microphones off just while she's speaking, otherwise you could get some feedback. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments section, or just save them until the end and we'll have a question period at the end of the session. So to get to the comment section, it's probably along the bottom of your screen. In the middle of the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little comment section. You can add a comment in there. But as we don't have lots of time this evening, I'll pass over to Karen. Welcome, Karen. Thank you for speaking with us this evening.
Thanks very much, Kim, and hi everyone. This is not quite so much fun as seeing your faces as I present, but hopefully from the comfort of your own home you can join in. So I'm going to share some slides with you. With a little bit of luck. Oh. How's that, Kim? Yep, great. Okay, so tonight I'm really excited to be talking to you about beneficial insects in your garden. And I'm going to make the case that there are heaps and heaps and heaps of them. You may have already seen some of them. I hope to introduce you to perhaps some more. And along the way, I'd like to tell you a few stories about what they're getting up to and why it's in our interest to be attracting them in our gardens. So there's all sorts of reasons that you might be interested in insects. As gardeners, often the first thing that springs to mind when you think of an insect could be a pest. And I'm going to try and flip that tonight and say, well, hang on a minute, maybe the pests are the ones that are getting in my face and making themselves known. Who else is here and how can I encourage them? So my particular interest is in pollinator insects. And you might be surprised to know that that's not just one particular species, the honeybee, it's a whole raft of insects. We rely on them to do this, to feed us. A lot of our food comes from insect pollinated plants, but also to keep our plants going in the wild as well and in the bush. Oh, I think I've lost my slides.
We're seeing
Keith. Yeah, if you just request, Karen,
yeah,
request control again. If you can see that. Yep, request control and share. So please, if people can keep their hands off request control or the little button that says share content, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
And we're back, I think.
Yep, you're back.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think I was saying that pollination is also really important for native plants. So how do native plants reproduce? Well, in a variety of ways, but a whole suite of them are reliant on insects pollinating them in order for us to get more plants without necessarily having to plant them ourselves. So that sort of leads on to that insects are really important in our broader landscapes. So our gardens can help to support other wildlife and add to habitat, which contributes to conservation. So our little patch can play a role in here. And insects are really important in this mix. So if your favourite critter is actually a bird or a mammal or a reptile, you might want to think about what it is that your favourite critter is eating. There's a good chance that somewhere in the food chain there's insects in there. So you have a vested interest in knowing about the insect, even if it's not really your cup of tea yet. Insects play important roles on all sorts of levels. I'm going to walk you through some of these, but insects, as well as pollinating and being food for other critters, are also really great. Some of them are great at waste management. They're breaking down things. They're helping to therefore build soil. They're helping to aerate the soil. They're helping to make the whole system work. And we can easily overlook that, I think. There's also a great opportunity here that insects are everywhere and numerous, and so they're a really easy way for you to connect with nature wherever you are. You don't have to go somewhere special necessarily to find insects and to have wonder and think, what are they up to? Oh, this fits with this, goes with this. My dot points are a little out of order, but the other interesting part is that insects can be really valuable in what the technical term is integrated pest management. That is one lot of insects helping to control other insects, to keep things in balance and to ensure that we don't have the pest problems that perhaps are springing to mind when you're thinking about insects. So tonight we're going to just touch on a few of these themes, get to know some insects. I'm going to walk you through some big groups that you might already be seeing, talk about how you can support them in your garden and potentially also into farming or productive landscapes as well, if that's what you'd like. I'm going to let your questions help to guide some of that. So just to remind you, insects are invertebrates. There's really defined things that make an insect. They have segments to their body, typically a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They have antennae, 3 pairs of legs, and usually 2 sets of wings. So spiders aren't insects, and birds aren't insects. But within that huge group of insects, we have enormous diversity. So in Australia, we're not quite sure, but tens of thousands of different species of insect. And then we can think about how many of each of those species, how many actual insects are there? Well, we're talking millions and more. Insects are found in every environment and they've got heaps of adaptations to make them good at what they do, where they do it. So this is a fabulous website, What Bug Is That? By the CSIRO. It's an introduction to insect families. Here we're looking at some orders of insects, big groups. And you might look at those and think, oh yeah, I know something about flies. I know something about dragonflies. But it's really where it gets really exciting is when you start to drill down and realise the diversity within each of those groups. So there are families and then there are subgroups within that and then individual species. What makes insects sometimes tricky to identify, but also fascinating, is that they have these diverse life stages. So an insect doesn't look in its one form all its life. You know, we look like small humans when we're born, we look like middle-sized humans when we go to school, we look like big humans when we're out in the world, and when we're older we tend to get to be a bit smaller humans again. But we look the same all the time. With insects, they can look completely different. Their entire body changes through these different life stages. Now, this is a great adaptation. It's got all sorts of aspects to it. I'm sure that you know the life cycle of a butterfly. You know, starts with an egg, turns into a caterpillar, forms a chrysalis, and then emerges as the adult butterfly. We can kind of remember that. But maybe you don't spend so much time thinking about some of the other insects. So if I say, what's a baby fly? You go, oh, it's a maggot. Have you seen baby ladybugs or ladybird beetles in your garden? They're here on the 3 o'clock of the clock, looking spiky, grub-like, but spiky, and sort of like a caterpillar. But then they turn into the ladybird that we all go, oh, I know what that is. The same with beetles. Maybe you've seen a curl grub in the ground, but it's in its adult form, it might be up in the trees, in the flowers, looking like a beetle. And if I asked you to describe what a baby bee looks like, maybe if you're not a beekeeper, you'd struggle to think that, oh, bees are just the adult form. They also are a grub-like critter. They also have a bit of a cocoon-like stage. So all these things mean that there's a lot of diversity in when we're going to see insects and what they'll look like when we see them. We might not recognise the ladybird larva. We might think it's a grub and want to squash it, but we shouldn't because it's doing important work. You can see here there's lots of difference between how many stages each individual insect has between species, how long it takes. The bees in my bee hotel, typically it's a year from when the egg is laid in the bee hotel to when the adult bee emerges. That's a huge amount of time. With flies, sometimes they're turning around generations in days. We also see that many of these insects have seasonality. When do we see the adults? When do we see the caterpillars? So I'm going to walk you through a couple of groups. And I wonder how many of these you already know. Now, surely everyone knows what a bee is, right? In the top right, I've got a honeybee. We keep them in big white boxes and we like to eat the honey. But did you know that in Australia we have more than 1,600 species of native Australian bee? And in our area, they're not making honey and they're working independently, not in a colony like the European honeybees do. So I'm going to try and encourage you to think more broadly about, well, what does a bee look like? How will I know it when I see it in my garden? And one of the top tips for knowing that you've seen a bee is to see that it's got some pollen carrying hairs. So here, this bee in the middle has, it looks like really fat orange leg in the middle of the bee, but actually the leg is blue and it's covered in orange pollen. Other bees, native Australian bees, carry the pollen on their tummies and you'll be able to see, you know, there might be yellow or pink where other times it's turned from the white hair to being coloured by the pollen. Now, only bees collect pollen like this. So if you see an insect that's got pollen being collected to the leg or to the tummy, you go, that's a bee. And it's a female bee, because only the females are collecting pollen so they can put it into their nest. It's going to be food for the baby bees. Honeybees collect pollen for baby bees too, but they work together to feed them. So we can also look for some other characteristics of bees. They've definitely got visible antennae. They can be hairy, but not always. And it can be tricky when you're looking at a male because you're not going to have that pollen cue to give you the hint, oh, that's a bee. So I've noted here that in Australia, our native bees, about 3/4 of them nest in the ground. They dig holes in the ground. Yes, I'm still talking about bees. Isn't that crazy? The others usually use plant material. So often holes that other insects have made, like borers, or in pithy stems. And so in our area where it gets cold over winter, they'll overwinter by laying the eggs. The adults die because they only live for a few weeks. And those immature forms, maybe as a pupa or a larvae, so the immature bees overwinter, and then they emerge when all the flowers are warm and the going's good to go again. So
Karen,
yes.
Sorry, we've got a question here. All bees have 4 wings, is that right?
That is a true statement. So bees and wasps have 2 sets of wings and therefore 4 wings, whereas flies only have 2 wings. And sometimes we can actually see, I hope I've got a photo in a minute that we can see that difference. This is just to give you a bit of a, don't just take my word for it. Here is some, on the left-hand side, this is a native bee. She's dug down and made chambers in the ground in order to lay her egg, provision with some food, nectar and pollen, and then seal it up and go away. She's not going to raise these young. They're going to emerge sometime down the track after they've gone through these various life stages. And at the top here, I've got the same thing happening in a pithy stem. So in our area, often that will be in Dianella, maybe a grass tree flower spike, something like that. Here's a leafcutter bee, and she does have a white tummy, but all that yellow is the pollen that she's collected. And here are some tricky ones that are not so hairy. So these are all still native bees, and sometimes watching their behaviour might give you the clue. Other times, like the one in the centre bottom, we can see the pollen on the legs. So that is a female native bee. Would you have spotted some of those as wasps, I wonder? I think I would have when I started this game. Another interesting thing you might like to do is keep an eye out at night, because some of the male bees will actually congregate in a place at night. So these are blue-banded bees, and there's a number of different species that do this. I think this is really cool when it happens in my garden. Now, I've started with softly, softly. I think most people think bees are pretty cool, or at least understand that they're important. Now I'm going to move on to something a little more hardcore, which is flies, where everyone goes, "Ew, I don't like flies. They turn up on my barbecue and they make my sheep fly blown." But wait, that's only a couple of species. We've got more than 7,000 species of fly in Australia, and the vast majority are out there doing really important work that we give them no credit for whatsoever. So these guys are really great at breaking stuff down. That might be a carcass, it could be meat, it could be rotting vegetation. They're really good at this. They've got this sort of funny mouth part that lets them go. I bet you that came through really well on the sound. But they do other things as well. So that's the most important, probably the most important role they play. But there are a lot of flies that are helping to keep other insects in check, including other flies. So a lot of them are predators. They're also providing food. Lots of your favourite birds, mammals, reptiles are quite fond of fly for dinner. And some of them are also important pollinators. So my friends down the bottom here on the yellow flower where they're facing each other, they're hoverflies. So they come to flowers to feed, but in the process, they will move pollen around. And because they fly at temperatures that are lower than our native bees, that means they're quite important pollinators for plants that flower in the cooler seasons for our sort of area. Now, hoverflies are going for the prize for possibly the best fly in Australia, which is a coveted award that I look forward to handing out one day. Because not only are they pollinators, but they will lay their eggs where there are sap-sucking insects. So things like aphids, and their young will eat the aphids. So they're also pest controllers, and they're really important pest controllers. So if you see a hoverfly, it probably will be hovering above the flower, almost in mid-air. It seems like they're able to hover. Say g'day. Don't worry, you won't get stung, you won't get bitten, they won't turn up at your barbecue, they're not interested in your sheep, but they're doing important work, so let them be, or fly. Anyway, with flies, we've got lots of flies. I've put some here that look really similar. The one in the top right is a dead mimic for the honeybee. It's a drone fly, and it's intentionally trying to make predators think, I've got a sting. I'm dangerous, don't eat me. So you'll find that often these colours are repeated across these insects. Some of them really are sending a warning that they've got something dangerous or they're not tasty. Others are saying, I'm just going to pretend that I'm one of them in order not to get eaten. Again, we've got huge amounts of difference in their life cycles between all these different 7,000 species. So here are some pretty, this is possibly, I think, the bottom left, very good looking fly. It's a nectar sipping march fly. Yes, a march fly that normally would sip your blood. The females need the blood for their eggs, but no, this one just sips nectar. It's very, you know, okay, maybe not, but it's a great fly. In the top right, we've got one of the big predators. So it's hanging out with its, I don't know if you can see, but on the lower part of the flower, there's actually a little parasitic wasp and a moth. So this is a robber fly, and it's a predator of all sorts of other insects. But as a result, it's also a great pest controller. I've lost my button. There we go. So having dazzled you with flies, and you're loving them already, I know, I'm going to move on to wasps, which are possibly even less loved, and say that there's even more of them. We really don't know how many wasps there are species in Australia because we're still exploring and finding more, and not everyone is super keen to be keeping an eye out for wasps. Now, I'm going to say that wasps in your garden are a really great thing. Again, there's a whole bunch of them that will parasitize some of your pests. So sometimes when you see aphids in your garden looking a bit grey and kind of motley, it's actually they've been parasitized by the wasp. That aphid isn't eating anything, isn't doing anything anymore because the wasp has laid its eggs into or onto that aphid. So that the pest controlling side of wasps are really important. We've also got a whole bunch of critters that they're interested in because instead of collecting pollen like the bees, many wasps will build a nest into which they put food for their young that's made up of maybe caterpillars or spiders. You might have seen some of the mud dauber wasps go off, grab a caterpillar, bring it back and push it in. Or maybe you've broken one open and discovered that there's like 12 spiders in this mud nest. Well, that was all food left for their young. So when the young wasps emerge, they've got something to eat. I know this is wine and dine and you could be eating right now, but gross factor, sometimes they like to leave those spiders or caterpillars in there alive for them to eat. No, we're not having takeaway. No, it's not left behind. This is live food that you should, yes, sorry, continue eating. They will also parasitize grubs. So sometimes thinking about that curl grub that we looked at earlier, sometimes the wasp will burrow into the ground looking for the grub into which it can lay its eggs or either on it or in it. So all these are actually beneficial to us gardeners. We don't have to control those things because we've got these guys on the job. And I feel obliged to mention that we've also got some really special orchids like this one, a spider orchid, and it's pollinated by the male wasps who get fooled into visiting because the flower puts out a scent that is like the smell of female wasps. Oh, talk about a complicated relationship. So when we see wasps that have got a long, we say sting often, don't we? It's actually an ovipositor. It means it's an egg-laying tube or tool. So in many cases, they're going to use that to get into the prey, perhaps to lay the eggs, or maybe so they can lay into bark. Or at my house, they'll even lay into the bee hotel, you know, into the nests of other critters. So we can also be pretty amazed when we come across one of these in the garden. This is actually a wasp, but it hasn't got any wings. So the female is wingless. She relies on the male coming, picking her up, taking her out to wine and dine on the flowers. They mate and he drops her back to a place where there will be grubs of beetles in the soil, and she goes back down into the soil seeking out a place to lay her eggs. She's very beautiful, but you don't want to cuddle this one. She will let you know that she doesn't like cuddles. Here's her male, looks completely different and frankly looks a bit small to my eye, but that's what he looks like. Ooh. Uh-oh. Here we go. Here's a different but similar situation. You might see these on eucalypt flowers, a large wasp, and it looks like it's got something on its bum. The thing on the right-hand side is a honeybee bottom for size. This is actually the female. So she's wingless and tiny compared to the male, so really diverse. I don't know that if we saw her by herself that we would recognise her as a wasp at all. Another fabulous group is butterflies and moths. And as gardeners, I think often we go, oh yes, that's a lovely butterfly, that's a lovely moth. There are some caterpillars. So we can't have butterflies and moths without having caterpillars. But again, we need to note that there's very, very few species of caterpillar or butterfly and moths caterpillar that cause damage. The one we think of all the time is the cabbage white, and of course it's an introduced species. So a lot of our native caterpillars are not going to be causing damage in your garden, but will be encouraging more birds, other insects, because they themselves are food. So keep an eye on those caterpillars. If they're not causing damage, let them go. We've also got lots and lots of species of beetle. And in your garden, you might be interested that these guys are doing some great work to break down material, to create soil, make nutrients available to other critters or to the soil. And I guess the poster child for beneficial insects is often the ladybird or ladybird beetle. So we mentioned before that they're really good at controlling aphids, but you might not realise that as well as that, a lot of beetles are important scavengers. So again, that's that breaking down and getting rid of waste. And even some of them are pollinators. Again, there are a lot of species, birds, maybe you've got some nice mammals like squirrel gliders or something like that that really like these guys to eat. So when you see lots of beetles hanging around, they're all going, oh, dinner's up, dinner's up. I've added this one. These guys aren't pollinators, but lacewings or net-winged insects, as the group is known, are really interesting. You're not that likely to see them in your garden. They tend to fly more at night. They're quite small. You can see I've put a ruler next to the green one down there. But again, they will eat a whole host of really quite small insects. So you see here mites and scales and mealybugs and moth eggs and aphids. That sounds like pest control to me. So an interesting fact is that green lacewings, like next to my ruler, will eat up to 60 aphids an hour. That's a pretty good rate, I reckon. Again, they make a tasty meal for a whole bunch of other critters you might be interested in attracting to your garden. And the pink-eyed mantis here is just reminding me to let you know that I've just let you know about a few groups of insects. Of course, there are many, many more in your garden, and you might tell me about some of those or have some questions about those as well. I'm more than happy to talk other bugs as we go along. So if we're wanting to support and attract insects, what are we going to do? Well, the first thing is we don't have to have a dedicated garden for this. We can integrate this into our existing garden. And for some of you, you might also be thinking about how can I integrate this into a more productive landscape, you know, maybe in a shelter belt or in other places. I'm going to focus on the garden, but I've got a couple of tips for where you're going to find some additional material. What we find is that in many cases, we can apply broad rules, but of course, if you've got a particular pest that you're trying to deal with, you might be trying to attract particular insects. Vice versa, if you particularly love native bees, you might like to try and plant and provide what native bees like. I really recommend having diversity. Diversity of almost everything brings a diversity of almost everything. So it's a really great way. And from your observations, you might decide, what you're going to do more of. We do need to be careful. I'm going to recommend that local native plants is a really great way to get into attracting a lot of these insects and other critters in your garden. But it doesn't have to be only that. So you might use other Australian plants and you might use exotics. We just need to be careful that we're not introducing something that is prone to being weedy. That's really not helpful. So in terms of flowering plants, we might think about the diversity of their flowering times and their shape or their colour and their size. Or you might already have some growing that you decide you're going to grow more of, because often having blocks of great plants will attract more insects rather than just having one. We can also think about this maybe from a habitat garden perspective. If you've already been thinking, how can I attract birds to my garden? How can I attract reptiles like skinks or those possums or whoever? We can apply the same thinking. What food do we need to provide? Is it nectar for energy? Is it pollen for protein? Is it prey? Do I actually want plants that do attract aphids just to have a little bit of aphid ticking over so that I've always got the aphid predator in the background, keeping them at just the right level? What are these insects going to eat when my plant isn't flowering? We can also think about, with caterpillars, you might like to think about the foliage you do want them to eat. Are there particular grasses that you want to provide because you love the butterfly that you will get as a result? We can think about how we provide shelter. Now, that's not a bird box. That's more about, as you would with birds, but it's where are these insects going to go when the weather's bad? Where do they like to lay their eggs or raise their young? Where can they be safe from predators? We can do all sorts of things to help. That range of foliage, having tussocks that they can get under, rocks and bark, different sorts of stems, maybe having some bush mulch in particular places, which is really replicating the idea of leaf litter, and even retaining some fallen branches with dead wood for them to use. Some insects will use water, and we need to be mindful that if we've got a pond or a bird bath, insects generally can't swim. So we might need to be providing access, some stems, some rocks, something they can stand on while they sip, rather than go for a dip and not come out. Butterflies will actually sip from wet soil, and apparently they're taking up nutrient as they take up the water. So they like a damp soil spot. And if you are providing it, you might have it as part of your frog bog or as part of another feature in your garden, but you'll find that the butterflies are really congregating there. We can seek to add connectivity, just like squirrel gliders will only glide a certain distance from tree to tree. So too, if your garden is an island, maybe you can add connectivity or have some blocks so that they can get around. And we can do that with the layers from the ground level to the understory to the mid-story and up. Lots of different habitats for different insects. I'm going to argue that by doing any and all of these things, you're going to attract a lot more than insects. You're going to attract a whole host of things, but you're also going to save yourself a whole load of gardening work, which you can focus on, smelling the roses or counting the native bees. So I would usually talk a little bit about some plants, and I'm not going to do too much of that because really it's your garden and you know what you like. But keep an eye out for the ones that are attracting the sorts of insects you'd like more of. Here are some examples, very broad. Going out to perhaps the ones that are a little bit bigger, the shrubs through to the trees. And we could pick local again for these, or we might go out to some other species. And the same, don't forget the exotics. If you love a particular exotic, there's nothing wrong with that. And likewise, if you want to be seen as a gardener who's not lazy, you didn't forget and it didn't bolt. It's that you let the vegetable go to seed, and in the process, your insects got a feed on your brassicas, your broccoli, your lettuce, or maybe it's the mint that's flowering. All of these bring in a whole load of insects. And you don't have to feel bad about that you haven't cleaned it up yet. I'm just going to mention a couple of resources if you're keen to use or get more into it, I guess. The first is one by Goulburn-Broken CMA, and I think Kim is able to share this spreadsheet with you. It's an attempt to note some local native plants, as well as where they grow, what sorts of soils they like, and how they can be used in our systems. So for shelter belts or bush tucker or in a water-wise garden. It also talks about when they flower and then has a note about which particular insects might like them. It's also letting you know whether they're edible by other animals, which might be important at your place. And along these lines, we're starting to see some more guides like this. Now, this isn't quite your area. It's a little bit more me, Northeast Victoria. ANU's Sustainable Farms program, I believe they're going to replicate these in other areas. They've got a powerful pollinators guide. Now, obviously, we're focusing on particular groups of insects here. But again, gives you an idea about the growing conditions and type of plant that you've got, when it's going to flower, and then some really nice notes about what it provides. Is it nectar? Is it pollen? And which groups of insect are interested? I don't think you can see that, but it's actually noting native bees, honey bees, hoverflies, wasps, butterflies. So giving you an idea. I've got the link there and I'm happy to pass that on afterwards if you're keen to check that out. It is focused on farms, but of course we could apply this in a garden as well for some of the smaller plants. And a plug for the Euroa Arboretum, who do have a Gardens for Wildlife program that includes insects. They've got lots of local native plant information on their website, and I really like that they will note the wildlife value of a lot of those plants, including for insects. So that's another great place to browse if you're trying to work out what might I add to my garden for insects. A quick plug. If you're keen to know more about the insects in your garden, I'm involved in a national citizen science project where we ask you to spend 10 minutes watching your choice of flowering plant and to let us know what you see. So this is about you slowing down and getting to know those insects, but also about us collecting some data about which insects are on which plants all across Australia. We've been doing this for 6, maybe approaching 7 years. We do it twice a year, and you don't have to be an expert. We've got really simple categories, which I've just more or less run you through. So you're just popping what you see into these categories. We've got some fact sheets as well to remind you what I've just said, but it is a great way to pay more attention to what's in your garden and maybe even realise there's a lot more going on than perhaps you would see if you're just backwards and forwards and not really stopping. So the next count's the 18th to the 15th of November, and we'd love to have you on board. You can submit a photo if you want to, but you don't have to. You don't need to know species or anything like that. It's really broad, and I think you'd have a lot of fun. Some of you have already played, I know. So wildpollinatorcount.com. So I'm going to wrap up, I think, with me presenting, and I'm really happy to take some questions and see what you think. But I just wanted to say I've found that watching insects in my garden is not only a great connection to nature that I can do just by taking 2 steps out the door, but it's absolutely fascinating what you can find. So this is a feather-horned beetle. You might have seen them. They're in your area. They're quite common, but they fly for only a limited amount of time. And when I found one, I found a whole heap of them in my garden. I looked up the scientific papers and there weren't any, there were almost no information about the ecology of these critters. This is a really common story with insects. We've each got the opportunity with smart devices and the opportunity to share and to learn. And there's so much we don't know about Australian insects. So I really encourage you to pay attention, to see what you see, by all means connect with me if you'd like some help getting to know more about those insects. But even with your friends, you know, get to know some of these guys. We rely on them. They're crucial. They're great workers in the garden and easily overlooked. So I hope that this has given you a little taste. And if you're not already getting out in the garden looking for these guys, maybe tomorrow, if it's fine, you might have a little look and see what you